Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai
Jai
Guru.
Guru. Welcome to this episode of Yogananda Podcast, where we're covering line by line the autobiography of a yogi. We will be covering a couple of subjects today. They're very, very interesting. We've, as always, got some segues and trying to keep the segues to a minimum because we don't want the podcast to be 10 hours long. There's so much content that we could cover here. We'll keep it as succinct as possible. But if you want to follow along, you can hit the pause button and you can start by reading. Early in their married life, my parents became disciples of a great master, at the first sentence of the paragraph, until the end of the story where Lahiri Mahasaya met Yogananda's parents. And we're reading up to the last sentence in the last paragraph reads, "Your life shall surely be linked with his own, the master's blessing never fails." So if you want to pause, read this, come back to us, and join us. Pause. Okay, and welcome back. Welcome back to those who that did it. So we're going to be covering, in the first paragraph that we're going to cover really is about Yogananda's parents, their married life and how that changed after they were initiated into Kriya Yoga. And essentially the rest of the paragraphs that we'll cover, depending on how you count in the next 10 paragraphs or so, talk about Lahiri Mahasaya meeting Yogananda's parents and the amazing story of how that came about. So two main subjects here that we'll cover. So let's jump into it then, shall we? So the first one, the paragraph, short paragraph, essentially saying that Yogananda's parents, described by Yogananda, led a very spiritual life before they met Lahiri Mahasaya, but this was somewhat accelerated, I think it's safe to say, after they met Lahiri Mahasaya. And Yogananda's mother made a comment to his eldest sister, Rama, that she and the husband, Yogananda's father, only slept together once a year for the purposes of having children. And that was it, actually. It's just left there, isn't it? It's just almost it's just a statement, and then he moves on to a story, right? And I think this is kind of a theme here in some ways in this episode, where it will play throughout many different chapters in the book, where Yogananda simply states the truth, very kind of starkly, kind of on its own, kind of moves on. And there's some magic to that, isn't there? And we'll talk about that again later in the episode. But first, Priyank, do you want to jump in with the comment?
Yeah, before that, the statement about moderation in the sexual life, he puts in a statement which is easily missed. So he says that, they became disciples of Lahiri Mahasaya early on, and this association strengthened father's naturally ascetical temperament. And that's easily missed. So that means that he was always naturally quite inclined to certain spiritual qualities, as it were, and then meeting Lahiri Mahasaya basically made it like almost like the icing on the cake, and it just solidified all those things. So ascetical temperament, well, we know he was like, he lived a very frugal, simple, low attachment to material things life. And then as soon as he got initiation, I suppose all of that was probably like confirmed to him, and then he kind of now like had an excuse to like really swallow it. Like before, maybe his wife would say, or like his children might try and convince him to be a bit more materially inclined, especially because of his senior position. But now he's not only was he naturally like that, now he's got Lahiri Mahasaya saying, your guru, your father's guru is instructing us to be this way.
Mm-hmm. As far as role models go, he's a pretty great role model to have in your life, and I guess that's going to be a reason why Yogananda certainly chose to come through into this life, incarnate into this life, or rather not incarnate. Priyank, you taught us in the last episode an avatar like
He resurrects. Resurrects.
Yes, he resurrects. It doesn't incarnate, right?
Yes.
So
we incarnate. We let them resurrect.
Yeah, right. Sure. Which is great. So we've got a very well-disciplined, kind and thoughtful set of parents in Guyana, and Bhagabati in Yogananda's parents. They lived a yogic lifestyle before Yogananda was even there. Mike, do you want to jump in?
Even though he took a while to find his guru in this life, for Yogananda's parents, if you have those inclinations, it probably also says that in previous lifetimes they were yogis and were following gurus, maybe even the same guru, maybe they were disciples of Lahiri Mahasaya even in past lives already. And that's kind of a bit of a giveaway, those habits.
Priyank, jump in.
I believe this is the first mention of Lahiri Mahasaya, isn't it, in the actual autobiography? So for listeners who have no clue who Lahiri Mahasaya is, Lauren, why don't you tell us?
Wow, you've sprung that on me. Thanks for that, Priyank.
That's all right.
I was just flicking through the book thinking, oh yes, it hasn't come up yet, has it? So I feel like I'm not probably well versed to tell about Lahiri Mahasaya and his life. But alas,
who is he? Just please go on a very simple vibe. Who is he first?
On a simple vibe, he was, well, I believe, an avatar. Is that correct? Yeah. He was a great master of his time, and he initiated many people into yoga, Kriya Yoga as well. And consequently, he finds his image on our temples at home for those SRF members that follow that path. Many a time I've gazed upon his photograph and felt quite illumined. So yes, he's very influential, should we say. But he has been described as high-souled, noble-minded, monogamous, and large-hearted. So
nice, yes. Very nice. Chris, what does he mean to you? Like, tell us.
He reminds me of my dad. I don't know if I've mentioned this before. he looks really similar to my dad.
That's so cool.
I mean, it's my dad must be quite similar to Bhagabati in some ways. To be honest, there's so many similarities. My dad is a very saintly, living man. So just the fact that he looks like Lahiri Mahasaya as well, it's strange. I think when I first started going to the centre in London Centre, I'd find my eyes just drawn to Lahiri Mahasaya, and I was like, oh, like eventually the penny dropped that maybe there's some similarity there. But what he means to me is essentially what we're going to kind of get into here. He was known as the incarnation of yoga, yoga avatar, by Yogananda. I think it was mentioned actually earlier on in the initial statements of the book. But really, he was somebody who had many children as well himself. So he lived like a house yogi in essence. And I did mention this before, but to me, he's a noble character that is more of an example to the majority of people, let's say, that might find their way into the path of yoga, that have families, kids of their own, responsibilities in that way, jobs and everything. It's more of this household idol to look up to, a role model. So he is very different in that way from the other lines of gurus that we have. And an ideal yogi householder is how he's described by Yogananda, I believe. So to me, that's how I would picture him in my mind. What about you, Grant?
No, I was just going to say that, firstly, Lauren, I think you've received your first hospital pass, so welcome to the christened club.
Welcome to the team.
There'll
Initiation.
There'll be many more of those, and you can throw some back at me as well, of course.
Oh, I will.
Chris often does. But
I try.
I was going to say, you say that your father looks like Lahiri Mahasaya. My father-in-law looks very, very much like Sri Yukteswar.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Nice.
And he's got
As disciplined.
Yeah, and he's disciplined. He's got a similar temperament as well.
Nice.
But yeah, Lahiri Mahasaya is for me is just say he looks like for me he looks like a very, very typical Indian man that always like you'll see many of if you go to like a rural part of India. And to me, he's just literally one of those many wise men. So when I saw him, he looks the most conventional of all the masters in terms of what I imagine like a wise, holy Indian man to look like, because I've seen so many Lahiri Mahasayas in India. So he's for me is most familiar.
Good. And Mike, what is he to you? Same question.
In a way, he's kind of where it all began. When you look at our line of gurus, he's like the first, how should I say this, historical figure, because Babaji is a bit of a mystical figure, isn't he? He's like someone you would go, like I would do, Google someone and find his Wikipedia page. There wouldn't be a birth date. There would be a lot of things missing, right? No documents or anything like that. And Lahiri Mahasaya, he's the link to Babaji in our line of gurus. And then from then on, it went to other historical figures like Sri Yukteswar and Yogananda. And in that sense, he's kind of the original Kriya Yogi.
Yeah, and what an awesome start to the path of yoga, let's say, for Yogananda's parents, and as we mentioned, what great karma they must have had to be initiated by Lahiri Mahasaya himself. Because I think I'll speak for myself, but probably for you guys as well. It'd be great to be initiated by a living guru such as Lahiri Mahasaya. Frank?
Yeah, definitely great. Going back to this statement of strengthening, the association naturally strengthened his father's natural ascetical temperament. I'm just trying to recall, like when I became a lesson student, how I personally changed. And I would say I had a similar experience, and I'm not saying that I'm naturally ascetical, but in terms of like my just my qualities and my outlook on life, before I started getting into this path, it was all very well aligned with what came after. And then when I did become a lesson student, everything became so much clearer, and ideas that were just ideas became crystallized truths. Everything from like diet, fasting, simple things like truthfulness and honesty, and I just thought that's quite a good. I think so that statement probably applies for many of us as well as Bhagabati.
Yeah, no doubt there's a crystallization and an energy transfer of sorts, right? Where you've got this very powerful lineage of gurus and saints that we're blessed with at the SRF. So we're unbeknown to us, we're probably benefiting a great deal, let's say, in this regard.
Yeah, energy transfer, and also if that link existed beforehand, then that energy was already there, but dormant, as it were. So then this process of pledging to become a lesson student is no small thing, really, is it? It's the lessons. There's a pledge, isn't there? you pledge to sincerely learn, and not to talk about it to others, and all these things are small. They feel like small things, but they're not small things, I don't think, especially if you really take it to heart. So I think if if you already had a connection there that was dormant, then this, if you when you willingly go through that process of pledging to commit to studying the lessons, then that dormant connection becomes a very live one.
It is an interesting subject and a segue of a segue. But you do see maybe in the more common spaces outside of yoga confusion with this regard. Why would you need to initiate, and why would you need to pledge yourself and maybe not talk about certain things? And there's lots of questions as to why, but I think when maybe in wisdom something, in knowledge it's a little bit more tricky to kind of parse out the truth. But in general, you don't want to put something like a powerful tool in the hands of someone or something that can't handle it or doesn't know how to handle it, essentially, is what I would say. So you want somebody who knows how to handle that tool and can teach you exactly how to handle a tool because they're masters of it themselves. That's generally how I interpret it. But Mike, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to add to that I really like that metaphor. And I also think that the tool doesn't really work properly if you, like we talked in the last episode about the guru-disciple relationship and how important it is. And I feel like the guru gives you the tools, but he also makes them work. Otherwise, so I wouldn't say like one part of being able to become self-realized is you need to have a true guru, and the guru needs to help you. Otherwise, I think you can have all the tools in the world and you won't reach the goal.
Yeah, Yogananda talked about having a saintly person in your life is way better than having endless supply of maybe intellectual knowledge. And we have many of them, thankfully. Lauren?
Yeah, I also feel like when we take that pledge, even in the initial lessons, you are making a vow, really, to change your entire existence for the rest of your life, and to actually bring something into your sphere that will alter the trajectory of where you'll be. And it's like Priyank said, it's not to be taken lightly either. And I think, you can feel that when it's right for you, that's the path to go down,
And ultimately pray to Yogananda, ask for direction, and am I doing it right? Am I ready?
Yeah.
But yeah, lots we could go down on that route. I did just want to say, Lahiri Mahasaya previously known, that says Shyama. I'm going to picture this, Priyank. I can already see
Shyam.
you're looking at me.
Shyam.
Shyam, just Shyam. Charan Lahiri. Yeah. But Lahiri Mahasaya, the name itself, looking this up, because there's meanings behind the titles given. It was household, noble-minded, magnanimous, noble, large-hearted, generous, kindly man. And Maha in Sanskrit means a great, a big, a great one. So the breakdown of this word is a very beautiful reflection of the man and soul himself. So awesome title there. If anybody didn't know, now you know. But he was, as I mentioned, a little bit unusual amongst the Indian holy people and our lineage of gurus himself, being a householder. He married, he raised a family, and he was working in the government for quite some time. And as I mentioned, Yogananda called him the ideal yogi householder. We have some bits to read out, but before that, jump in, Priyank.
Of course, Sri Yukteswar was a householder as well before he took his vows. But the difference was that even after Lahiri Mahasaya became realized and he stayed in his marriage and he was initiating and he was a guru while still having a householder life, which is the unique element, because Sri Yukteswar was also previously married and had a child. a daughter.
Thank you very much
And
for
Babaji,
bringing that
and
knowledge.
Babaji, we have no clue. We just know he's got a sister.
Yeah, true. Laura, do you want to read out a little bit on Lahiri Mahasaya, his early life?
Yes, I have the knowledge now, everybody. As thanks to Chris. So thank you, Chris, for that. So Lahiri was born into a Brahmin family in the Gurney village, presently a neighborhood of Krishnanagar town in Nadia district of Bengal province. He was the youngest son of Muktakashi. Is that right? Muktakashi? Muktakashi?
Muktakashi, yeah, that's correct.
There you go.
Correct.
Wife of Gaur Mohan Lahiri. His mother died when he was a child. There is very little known about her, except that she was a devotee of Lord Shiva. At the age of 3 or 4, he was often seen sitting in meditation with his body buried in the sand up to his neck. When Lahiri was 5, the family's ancestral home was lost in a flood, so the family moved to Varanasi, where he would spend most of his life.
There's lots to pick apart there, but Brahmin family, we talked about this in a previous episode, the priestly people of the Indian caste system. So he was born into that. Generally speaking, they're seen as members of the caste family that are they themselves alone capable of performing certain vital religious tasks. So he was certainly born into that life to begin with. Now, his life, we can go into a little bit more detail. But first, Lauren, do you want to jump in?
What I think's really interesting is the mention of, when he was as young as 3 or 4, so before even perhaps he could have a really in-depth conversation about things, he was meditating. And I think there is something very, very important in this, because I feel, well, for me personally, and I'm sure for many of us in our own lives, before we've come to the path that we're on, we have either done things or thought things that have then become apparent when we have learned something along the path. So it's already innate within our journey. So yeah, I just think it's interesting, and it says a lot that he's done that at 3 or 4.
Yeah, and imagine being three or 4 and your friends at that age, they're living quite a different life than how many kids really certainly in this day and age in the Western world meditate. None. That's not a thing in India, is it, friend? Do you see often kids, unless they're maybe in families that do yoga, do they normally do that?
No.
Certainly not. They're out running in the fields and playing with animals and things. So
you're asking him if he's seeing them in Harrow or in India.
Yeah, exactly. his family members, yeah. But Mike, do you want to continue reading a little bit about Lahiri?
As a child, he studied Urdu and Hindi, gradually moving on to Bengali, Sanskrit, Persian, French, and English at the government Sanskrit college, along with study of the Vedas. Reciting the Vedas, bathing in the Ganges, and worship were part of his daily routine. Wow. In 1846, he was married to Srimati Kashimoni. They had 2 sons, Tinkuri and Dukuri, and 3 daughters, Harimoti, Harikamini, and Hari Mohini. His 2 sons were considered saints. Lahiri's wife became his disciple and was affectionately called Guru Ma. His work as an accountant in the military engineering department of the Indian government took him all over India. Very interesting life. So many languages that he studied, so many children. Yeah.
I love the Guru Ma.
The Guru Ma, yeah.
Yeah. His wife is being interviewed in a later chapter. We'll hear more about her.
Yeah, very beautiful, very blessed family. But it does segue us into what we are going to talk about for the majority of this podcast, which is the story of how Lahiri Mahasaya met. However, before we do, shall we delve into the celibacy and sex force topic, which is what was mentioned so indiscriminately by Yogananda in his genius ways, by his mother and father only sticking together maybe once a year. Lauren, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, what I thought was quite pertinent is the fact that it is just mentioned briefly and then moved on. And I think that says a lot about how not only they viewed that way of living, but how that way of living is like just a norm. You know, it didn't need to be made a thing out of. We didn't need to hear about it for 5 pages, because that's how life is lived if you are, you know, following that way. So yeah, I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, and also that if he'd really, for example, I've found some very good sections on celibacy in God Talks with Arjuna, which we'll read out in a second, but he could have filled a long section of this page about the importance of celibacy in the spiritual life and moderation, but he didn't. He just left it with this. It's not ambiguous, the slide. It's very clear, isn't it? But it requires you to just introspect as to what that means for not just your own life, but for humanity, and where we place all our emphasis in terms of like everything from like advertising to pop culture to movies. Literally, it touches every single aspect of our life space pretty much in that sentence. It's covered in, yeah. Mike?
Yeah, like you said, he does cover it though in other books, like in God Talks with Arjuna and also in the lessons. And I feel like the Autobiography of a Yogi is not really like a book where he's preaching. He's more explaining where he's coming from, like how his life became the life he lived.
Yeah, he obviously does talk about very deep, preachy type subjects much later on, but obviously it's not so much so at the start, and that's probably explains why he only did give this one line, because it's just like the reader's just 4 or 5 pages in and going into some deep like concept that's already, like, he's already talked about concepts that are away from, you know, Western thought, but to really take away like the sex life, that's like, that might be way too much, like if you go into the depth of this. So I think he's deliberately kept it really subtle here with the new reader in mind.
What I think I can liken this to is the subject of fasting as well, because we have a similar sort of relationship with food as I think we do sex in the Western world. And I remember talking to some of my nearest and dearest about fasting, and I can say there's a transition between the first reaction to the more recent updates, which is first reactions like, no, never, I could never do that. That's generally fasting, could never do it, couldn't even think about it. How could you go one day or even miss one meal? You know, how could you do that? To
not healthy.
It's not healthy. You know, you need to be eating 3 times a day. To more questions like, oh, so how does it work? And, you know, do you enjoy it? What do you get out of it? To the point where, you know, those people are actually doing intermittent fasting, or, you know, 18 hours a day or something, and they're slowly kind of breaking into it and seeing the benefits themselves. But I think that is an interesting initial reaction that I'd say the majority of people on the planet Earth would have to these subjects. So I think you're quite right there, Priyank. I think Yogananda is quite nicely just planting the seed, letting it grow, leaving it untouched, moving on swiftly into a subject that actually is really distracting, because as big a comment as that is, really, to say, okay, well, here's an exemplary life, and oh, by the way, look at what happens next is probably quite clever as well, because the story of Lahiri Mahasaya meeting Yogananda's parents is just mind-boggling. So, but do you want to make a comment then, Priyank,
yes,
in more depth on the sex force?
Big comment, I'm afraid. So prepare yourselves.
Strap yourselves in.
For some.
Strap in.
For some anti-sex talk.
Yes.
Not really, but talks about, I'm going to talk a lot about the philosophy of it, in the sense that what Guruji speaks of. Like, for example, he starts his intro to the God Talks with Arjuna. He talks about two like opposing forces. Like, there's two sides of you that want to rule. There's the king soul that wants to rule, and the soul has all, like, positive and spiritual qualities that we know of. Like, under the soul's guidance, for example, the sex impulse in man also is transmuted into the creation, i.e. on a purely spiritual plane of noble ideas, artistic masterpieces, of soul revolutioning books. But under the ego's regime, so if the ego rules, he describes that there's promiscuity and there's unbridled passion, and the body is kept constantly excited by and restless by the morbid impulses of the sex temptation. This insatiable lust imparted to the thought citizens makes them slaves, subject to moodiness, depression, irritability. The cellular inhabitants suffer debility, ill health, and premature old age and death. So you can see why he wouldn't want to include such heavy topics in the fourth paragraph, fourth book page, because it's quite deep. It goes pretty deep, isn't it? And yeah, Chris?
Whenever you're reading that list out, it's a who's who of what's going on in the world today, isn't it? Especially maybe in the West, where the sex culture is prevailing, and the restlessness is probably the key there for me. Where if your body's restless, it goes into dis-ease, and then it forms diseases and things like this. So it is curious. It's a curious thought to have, but science, I suppose, isn't going to be discovering that for maybe some time. So we have to take Yogananda's word for now, which is good enough for me to be quite frank.
Should we read on, Mike?
Man and woman, instead of seeking emancipation in God through soul unity, sought satisfaction through the flesh. The seed of the original error of Adam and Eve remains in all human beings as the first temptation of the flesh against the immaculate laws of spirit. Touch not the tree in the center of the garden. Each individual, since that dim era, has had to engage his soul in battle with the cosmically present temptation of sex. The creator in man has become a dictatorial creature.
Yeah, for those who haven't heard about Guruji's the symbology that's represented in the Adam and Eve story, it's quite profound, and it starts with this original sin quote, but the temptation that is like stuck with all humanity, which is kind of like emphasized there in that section. Yeah, Mike?
Even calls it original error here, right? Because sin is somehow this kind of word that many people associate with guilt, and error means like you are actually acting against your own good fortune, right? You're making a mistake.
And sin, there's actually no such thing as sin, as far as I'm aware, in Hindu culture. It's just consequence. What is the consequence of having a certain mentality, or acting promiscuously, or eating indiscriminately over the top, or drinking, etc. You can do all those things, but what are you ready for the consequences, be they positive or negative? So that's the underlying philosophy, as it were, and it's a slight nuance to the Western idea of the do's and do nots, as it were. Lauren, do you want to carry on reading?
The sex impulse is the single most physically magnetic power that pulls the life and consciousness down from spirit in the higher centers in the brain, out through the coccygeal center into matter and body consciousness. The beginner in yoga meditation experiences all too definitely how grounded he is by the stubborn attachment of his life and energy to the body, sometimes without realizing that it is his uncontrolled thoughts and acts of sex that are primarily responsible for his earthbound condition. The seeker after self-realization is therefore urged by yoga to take command of this rebel force. Married couples should practice moderation, with love and friendship predominating. The unmarried should abide by the pure laws of celibacy in thought as well as in act.
There's spiritual bombs in there, isn't there?
Absolutely. I love what he said there about love and friendship predominating, because isn't that the basis, really, of all true unions? Pure love and friendship. Really, what else do we need? Mike, yeah.
Yeah, Guruji says in another section somewhere that friendship is one of the highest forms of love, right? I think the highest form was the guru-disciple relationship. And friendship was very high up there because it is an unconditional love that otherwise you don't see often. You see it between mother and child. He gives a few examples. The other thing I liked here that he said celibacy in thought as well as in act, because not, first of all, the thing is, in my opinion, that whatever you think will happen eventually, right? So you're just building something up. So to keep it pure, you should not only try to act in a certain way, but also think in a certain way.
Yeah, it's quite powerful how he emphasizes how strong the pull of this like force is, the sex force. He says it's like the single most physically magnetic power that pulls life, consciousness down from the spirit, from the higher centers and the higher chakras into the lower chakras. And so, like, people, I've tried to have this conversation with some people about moderation and how sex is not necessarily a good thing. And obviously you already know where this conversation is going, but how do you tell someone that exactly this without being like preachy? It's quite a difficult thing, isn't it? Because like everyone, the common like scientific conception of a Western scientific conception of when you don't consider a higher purpose of God is that you were put on this planet to procreate. So sex is just one thing that you're meant to enjoy and you're meant to do. If you're not doing it, you're not fulfilling your purpose, because that's what you were put on this earth to do, because you don't have this conception of the higher purpose. So the battling that is quite a challenging concept. Mike.
And it's somehow one of the things that is difficult or complex about life. You could just say, oh yes, sex is evil and you never want to touch it, but then you do need it to actually have children. So it is not that easy. So, but that's why I use that word moderation as well, right? Which is sometimes even harder than just complete abstinence, where you do things exactly when you want them and not any other time.
Whenever I think about sex, simply put, I think people see it in a lustful way or in a loving way. And the people who see it in a loving way, it's probably quite problematic to an extent as well, because it's like, oh, well, sex is an expression of love. Like, you know, you do that with the one that you're close with. So it's still, you know, fine, and you can kind of indulge in it as long as you're doing it with somebody that you love. But actually what Yogananda is saying here is, with love and friendship predominating, that this, you know, this is actually what should take place. So you don't need to actually have the act of sex to have this friendship and love to predominate. Does that make sense? So a sexless marriage is seen as a bad thing, because there's no love in that marriage. No, there's no sex. So it must be a very kind of lacking of this love and friendship. But actually that's not what Yogananda is saying. So it's actually both, it's wrong on both counts in the world, in a sense, isn't it? If you look at it from that love and lust paradigm, which is interesting because it exists beyond the paradigm. So maybe that does make sense in the way that I'm framing it to an extent. Should we continue to read on, Brent?
Yeah, please, Chris. Yeah, please read. Yeah.
So they are blessed who are victorious over the sexual instinct. Because suppression may only increase one's difficulties, yoga teaches sublimation. The average person can be free of temptation by avoiding the company, environments, books, movies that stimulate sex thoughts, and by training the armies of self-control, by seeking good company, by proper diet, eating little or no meat, regular fasting, taking more fresh fruits and vegetables, by exercising regularly, by engaging in creative activities such as art, invention, writing. Above all, by keeping the thoughts on the wonder, peace, and all satisfying love of God. The insatiable desire for the pleasure of sex is transmuted by the divine love and ecstatic joy experienced in deep meditation.
Yeah, really. Yeah, Jai Guru indeed. Really beautifully expresses how we can take charge of that aspect of our lives. Not just take charge, but as Guruji says, to transmute it into this higher creative force. Not procreative force, but creative, creative in terms of you know, innovation type of vibe. Yeah, of Chris.
I think the one thing, having practiced what Yogananda is essentially preaching here, and what he's teaching, is that the subtleties of the things that we ingest and the impacts that it has is more obvious to me now than what it was 5 years ago. It was completely ignorant to it 5 years ago. But today it's almost hypersensitive. And I'm so much more, you know, through the practice of yoga, realizing the impact of this. So eating meats, avoiding eating meats, and eating little or no meats, Yogananda says here. Maybe the impact that might actually have in society. You know, we look around, we wonder why are people so mad, but we're really heavily meat eating kind of world. And it's just interesting reading this. So by being loyal to dedicated to the Guru's teachings, it actually does become quite obvious through experience, but you kind of have to have faith and believe in it to begin with to go down that path.
Sadly, Gandhi also mentions that spicy increases the sex impulse, and that's why he ate a lot of bland food, which I find very sad. But there's probably also some truth to that.
Do you like spice, Mike?
Yes.
I also think it's really. Oh no, say again, Chris.
Come to Ireland. We have everything's bland food there.
After that, potatoes.
Exactly.
I knew that was coming. Beat me to it.
I was waiting for someone to say it about potatoes. Like, it's not going to be me.
Yeah,
it's too PC. The PC force won't go down that line.
No.
But yeah, it's great also how he very clearly states the word and. When he talks about the outer, like your environment and the things that you're outwardly consuming, and the inner. So it's not an either or, it's a balance. And yes, you can change your environment as much as you like, but actually if you're not changed from within, your environment doesn't have an effect. You know, it's got to be the both. It's such a small word, but it changes everything. Because if you'd have put or, you know, it's such an important word, that and. Yeah.
Until you have mastery, I suppose, in the great ones. For the rest of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the list again, my dear listeners and friends, is that you have to train the armies of self-control by seeking good company, by proper diet, eating little or no meat, regular fasting, taking more fresh fruits and vegetables, and as Mike said, less spicy food, or in Indian
parlance. Doesn't say that.
As Mike said, I said, as Mike said, but I totally agree with that. By exercising regularly, by engaging in creative activities, I really love that part, such as art, invention, writing, and above all, by keeping good thoughts, picking thoughts on wonder, peace, and the all-satisfying nature of love of God, which is pretty cool. So then we can transmute that force into the divine and ecstatic joy experienced in deep meditation, which I think is really important. I need to probably make this list for myself. So the bravest of prophets dare to intrude their often unwelcome voices into the realm of this natural instinct to remind of the scriptural injunctions against promiscuity, adultery, aberrant behavior, indulgences the modern world calls free love. Slavery to sex is seldom based on love, and it is never free. Condemnation by religious moralists, however, does little more than create feelings of guilt in the so-called sinner, or cause him either to turn against religion, or more commonly, to justify his behavior by associating with those of comparable standards. The greater the victory of sex, the more buoyant the health, the more abundant the happiness. By keeping the mind on lofty thoughts, and by strenuous exercise, continuous action for God, and meditation, one can transmute the sacred and powerful creative force into physical strength and health, mental creativity.
Awesome. Forgive me, Lauren, jump in.
I was just going to say, I think it's really telling, excuse me, how it's more about redirection. It's not about suppression. It's not about, no, you can't do that and that's it, and you just hold it in. No, it's actually about redirecting that energy into something that's more for our highest good. And as you said, it's a powerful creative force. So there's no shame in having that force within us, but it's about where do you put it? And that's up to you. And as you said, Priyank, you just have to live with the consequence of one's actions, you know, and what that means for your karmic path.
Yeah, it would be great to have this teaching spread throughout all religions, because celibacy isn't something only for yoga, is it? It's actually practiced in a spiritual following. So yeah, which can come with great difficulties if you don't know how, as you said, Lauren, to maybe direct and to use it. You just say, no, you're celibate, that's it. It's like you're asking for more trouble there in many cases, aren't you? So Yogananda really does give us those tools. So that's covered. Have we bashed people over the head enough with this subject, Greg? Or do you have one more thing to add?
One more thing. This is not so deep. Let's tone it down a few notches. Mother once, the sentence reads, "Mother once made a remarkable admission to my eldest sister about this sleeping together once a year." What do you suppose caused them caused her to have this admission? Like, Roma was like, do you think she was getting married and perhaps his mother was giving her some advice? Do you think it was just a general mother-daughter discussion that you might have? I was just wondering, why would mother have this admission? Yeah, Lauren?
Well, and she had it to her eldest daughter, not her eldest son, which I think is very telling, because, you know, as my mother's daughter, those kind of conversations you do have with your mother. And I think it's really lovely how she just explained how she lived, rather than, I mean, maybe she did, but what I can gather from here, it wasn't this is how you should live. It's just, this is me, you know. And I think we learn a lot from our parents, don't we? So yeah, I reckon it was just a lovely little conversation between mother and daughter.
In a later chapter, we will see how the relationship is going between Roma and her husband, and how she's looking for a spiritual companion and how she will find one eventually.
Nice.
Nice, yeah. It's a universal subject, isn't it? And one that touches us all. So Yogananda does very artistically include that in this part of the early part of the book, to get us thinking nice and early, to challenge us nice and early. So look, that's just one paragraph, and we probably could be talking for at least another hour on this subject. We've got to get better at this. But hopefully the listeners are enjoying the subject and the content. Let's jump into the main subject of the episode, which is when Yogananda's father met Lahiri Mahasaya. Now, how he came to meet Lahiri Mahasaya is really wonderful, and we're going to break it down paragraph by paragraph essentially here. So initially, Abinash Babu is an individual mentioned by Yogananda. Now, this individual worked with Paramahansa Yogananda's father, and he was an employee of the branch line of the Bengal Nagpur Railway. So he actually worked for Yogananda's father. Bhagabati, we're going to refer to him as. That's all right. So Bhagabati had this employee, Abinash. Abinash was talking to Yogananda, saying, "Oh, have you ever heard of this wonderful story about how your father became a disciple?" And Yogananda was looking at him with great intrigue, and simply retells this story that Abinash gave to him, and he's kindly sharing with us. Now, Abinash, it did strike me that this is an individual who's a direct disciple of none other of Lahiri Mahasaya, so somebody who was on a great path of enlightenment himself. So no slow coach, spiritually, I'm sure. He would have been quite advanced, I'm sure. And he was telling many tales of great Indian saints. And I just thought to myself, well, wow, what early role models Yogananda had in his life. You know, people he was able to surround himself by. And even the stories of Indian saints. I would have loved those stories growing up as a kid. I never heard any such stories. I don't know, maybe Mike, maybe Priyank, you guys, Lauren, forgive me, maybe you as well, but you guys had some stories of Indian saints or saintly people like this growing up. I kind of fancied like the more Indian saints, the stories there are a little bit more, I don't know, like fun or something, some kind of fun aspects to them. Certainly, I'm biased by reading the autobiography of a yogi, and the stories of saints there are just really fun and really engaging, colorful. So maybe I am biased. Did that happen in your upbringing at all, guys? Did you have such great role models in your life and stories that you were told?
No, my uncle used to tell my eldest uncle used to tell very, very good spiritual stories. I do remember that. But that I don't know why what he did. I wasn't that into this stuff back then. I think it's just Indian, like especially the elder generation. This like a go-to subject of choice. But although my uncle was quite spiritually inclined, religiously inclined, should I say? Yeah.
Mike, you had your.
Priyank,
If you want to make a point.
Priyank pointed out multiple times how boring he finds the Bible because the miracles aren't good enough, and how much better.
He does often say that, yeah.
How much more interesting the Mahabharata is. But also one thing that I want to mention is that how blessed and harmonious Guruji's upbringing is, because sometimes you would think, okay, you have an avatar who was born and he has to leave his home and find his guru, and Guruji had to do that. But in the end, he finds his guru, who is then a disciple of also the same guru that his father is a disciple of, right? So in a sense, it was all kind of very harmonious, and he didn't have to go into a completely different path, but it was basically predestined everything.
I just wanted to go back quickly to Abinash, his how he'd tell a story about these Indian saints. Like Guruji in the Autobiography says, he invariably concluded with a tribute to the superior glories of his own guru. Now, how often do we speak to someone about religious topics of religion and spirituality and churches and yoga clubs and all that kind of stuff, and then the person you're talking to all very often then just says or makes some sort of justification or subtle statement as to why the one that they belong to or the one they go to is the best one. And this Abinash is obviously doing it here. And as devotees of Self-Realization Fellowship, we would say Abinash was absolutely correct, obviously, because Lahiri Mahasaya was the best, was the best there ever was, and there ever is, and there ever will be. But that's a WWF thing quote, by the way. Mike, do you remember that? But yeah, I think it shows loyalty or spiritual pride when people do this kind of method of preaching. They'll talk about a spiritual concept and then talk about their own path and how it's really well explained here, or doing it this way is really powerful. I personally do it, and I do virtually the same thing. And I also get annoyed when someone else does this thing. So yeah. I must myself be quite annoying when speaking to a neutral person or someone that's not in Self-Realization Fellowship. But I think I've got better. Anyway, Lauren?
Yeah, I feel like the word you just said sums it up. If you're preaching, it's probably from a place of pride, right? But if you are speaking just from your love, then I think that will touch the hearts of those that need to hear it. I know I certainly had that experience. I'm not sure if I ever recounted this to you, but I was very much an atheist at one point in my life. And I met this man, I think I may have mentioned, and he had such a strong love for God. And we became really good friends. And I was still quite, with my own beliefs about the world, but I was interested in what he had to say because I'm naturally curious. So anyway, he would just speak from his heart about, the love he had for God and, all of this. And I suddenly came to realize that how could God not exist when it shone so strongly through this man, And this dear friend of mine never tried to get me to see his side. He never ever tried to make me believe. He just simply wanted to express his love. And through that, it actually changed my life, because I probably wouldn't be sitting here today if that friendship wasn't divinely placed. So yeah, speak from love, and that will probably get further than
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Maybe it is about example and letting people ask as opposed to you outwardly.
Telling.
But people often ask, don't they?
Yeah.
So it's quite a very difficult balance to draw, isn't it? Yeah, Chris?
Two things. You've covered it really in the first one, which is you have to give people passes when they're talking about experiences that they've had. Because ultimately then you're only taking third-party knowledge and saying that you can apply it. So if somebody's really got an experience with an enlightened individual, a saintly individual that you don't know of, because they could well be enlightened or saintly, you just take it. You just roll with that. Because there are thankfully many saintly individuals throughout history that we can call upon to look forward to as examples. And secondly, what I was going to say was, here you have a devotee of Lahiri Mahasaya. Lahiri Mahasaya was the one to say that there was going to be a birth of an individual, and he was going to be very important. He was reminiscing about the coming of this individual that Abinash is actually telling the story to, right? So I'm going to just guess that he may already know a little bit about that story, possibly. So you could give him a pass for that, because he might want to be saying, "Oh yeah, you're the individual that Lahiri Mahasaya was talking about that was going to come and do great things." And maybe that was more of a private conversation between Yogananda and his parents. I don't know, probably, but close proximity will give him a pass for this instance of talking about the guru in his life that he loves, because he's probably well aware of the connection with Yogananda.
First, I enjoy that you called Lahiri Mahasaya the Brett Hitman Hart of our line of gurus, or of gurus.
You'll have to explain to listeners who that is.
He's I watched wrestling in the 90s, and he was.
I can't believe you remember the exact wrestler that said the quote as well.
I don't know, like some of those names, I can't forget about that. He was probably one of the most famous ones, and I was collecting the stickers and put them in the sticker book.
Is he the one that wore the pink trousers? Was that him? That was him, wasn't it?
Right. I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, the other thing is that I don't know. I maybe it's because I'm shy like that, but I almost never. I try never to talk to other people about my spiritual beliefs unless they ask me about them. And when sometimes people tell me about their spiritual beliefs, and then I often try to build a bridge between what I believe and what they believe, and try to find commonalities. Because I don't know, I feel like oftentimes somebody who has some kind of belief, why would I want to take it away from them, or why would I want to change theirs? Same way I don't like it when others try to change mine, right? I find that's an intrusion in my private space that in a very part that is very important to my life. And when I find commonalities with someone and we can agree on certain things, then I find that like a successful conversation.
Yeah, one thing that I've learned never to do again is to criticize other paths. Never ends well, people. No matter what the path is. If you're having a spiritual dialogue with someone about different paths, as Mike said, focus on the similarities and the common areas, and steer clear of any form of criticism. It'll come back to bite you.
Yeah, Yogananda talks about it himself, that there are many paths to God, and some are maybe a little bit more speedy than others, and that's ultimately what we have to accept, right? And
but every path says that theirs is the speediest, Chris.
But wasn't Guruji and the Guru's self-realization fellowship, sorry, saying that
a new word, realization.
Distracted.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
The
The ship of self-realization. Good times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the spaceship is the quickest one. Saying that maybe we had relationships with the gurus in past lives. We talked about this in previous episodes. So whenever we talk about gurus and our love for them, maybe the connection isn't going to be there for every single person on the planet because of this lineage that we're talking about. Maybe our souls have crossed paths in some previous life. Maybe that's simply what we're privileged to be able to be a part of. And it's not necessarily about trying to convince everybody on the planet because of that maybe connection. What do you think?
I like it. I like it.
You like it? Who knows? Yeah. I'll humbly say I have no idea about anything. I'll follow Guruji's teachings, and that's it. So we had this story unraveling here before, so we will get there to this story, to the main point of the episode. And it's quite an extraordinary story, really. Abinash, probably with a twinkle in his eyes, reliving a moment that he shared with the superior officer, as he put it, Bhagabati, Yogananda's father, where he had asked his superior officer, his line manager of sorts, hey, can I have a week off? I need to go travel to visit my guru in Benares. And that's a week, right? So you're talking about a lengthy amount of time to travel there and back. I didn't check the miles exactly, but I think it may be 100 miles. But if you're doing that by horse and cart and different things, then yeah, it could take a while. Priyank, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a couple of things. When he was relating this story to Guruji says here that when he asked the question, did you hear about this? Guruji says, I shook my head with a smile of anticipation. Like, I don't know if you, Lauren, I know you're into teaching as a profession, but have you ever had a student that's like really keen? It's like the best. It's like the best thing in the world, isn't it? And you can imagine Guruji. You can imagine Guruji being like the keenest listener to a spiritual story ever to be born. Because, like, especially like if you read Mejder and other books, then you'll see that he was literally running around everywhere, any spiritual story. So I can just imagine him like just eyes wide open whenever Abinash would talk about this. But something about that relating to the week's leave, Chris. This is a bit more significant because I doubt he would, if you take leave, there's only like 3 holidays, I believe, at that time, like Diwali and stuff like that, and Christmas perhaps. So if you took a week's leave, he probably wasn't getting paid.
Right, which maybe explains the comments that are to come. Because I was going to ask you guys what you thought about this, as to why he maybe came down so hard on poor Abinash for simply wanting to spend some time with his guru. The response came swift and sternly, and it simply came actually quite a cynical fashion, really, if we're going to be honest about it, chastising poor Abinash, saying, are you going to become a religious fanatic? And you should really recommend that you concentrate on his work if you really wanted to get ahead in life. Stop, essentially stop spending your time so frivolously on silly things that didn't matter as much as your career and so forth. That's the impression that I got when I was reading it. Lauren, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, isn't it quite telling that his father has a lot of how do you pronounce it? Ascetic qualities. So he's a very spiritual person. He's quite there, but this part of his spiritual advancement isn't there. He's still got that worldly view of, no, actually we forge our way in the world, because he's saying to this poor man, what are you doing going on a spiritual journey? Why don't you just do your work? So I think that's quite interesting. I don't know, what do you think, Chris?
I pondered this a little bit, to be fair. I keep up front. I didn't really know. But what Priyanka just mentioned there might shed a bit of light on this, because Indian culture, there are many sort of more spiritual elements to the holidays. We have holidays here in the UK, of course, and in the Western world, but they're not quite, I'd say, as spiritually inclined across the year. So I'm not sure on that element. And if you have to take paid time off, that really could be quite sound advice, like in general, if it wasn't really for a spiritual practice, like, hey, if you want to keep doing well in your career, don't just take random weeks off, because you need to focus. But this wasn't any random week, was it?
But Lahiri Mahasaya says, Bhagabati says, are you going to become a religious fanatic? So if you imagine in India, even back then, there would have been like so many sadhus and priests and religious men like outside temples and begging, and so like this is like a part of the culture that no one really enjoys in India. So least of all a Bhagabati who's like, make your way in the world, don't beg for alms, you've got a pair of hands, you've got a mind to think, don't beg, you should make your own way, be creative, all that kind of stuff. So he probably has this view, or no, he would have had this view of all these lunatic religious people that are just kind of like a leech on society, as it were, and this is probably what he doesn't like about the religious element. So he may have been spiritual, but he certainly wasn't religious.
Mike?
I completely agree with Priyanka just said, that there is probably he was already jaded by all those spiritual teachers out there that he didn't find very inspiring and that he didn't care about. And in that sense, he felt that this was a waste of time. And also he seems to be a person with an extreme work ethic who was very driven. Like we learned about a bit about his life in the previous episode. And so he worked his way up and even without a father, carried his whole family, and then started his own family and carried that. And he was always a role model in that sense.
The one thing that I, thinking about this more clearly now, is that if we know anything about the man, was that he was dedicated to service, wasn't he? We talked about that in the previous episode. So his way of living in the world was to be of service to others, and that's fundamentally, one of the greatest things that we can do, right? In this creation. And so his way of expressing himself was through that mode, that method, that channel. So it's maybe saying, hey, like, do something really impactful, meaningful that you can kind of quantify. But he was later to change his mind, right? But before we get into that, Lauren, do you have another comment?
Yes, I noticed something. So a fault on my part, I admit, when saying my first comment. It says he inquired. He didn't scorn, he didn't scoff, he just inquired. And that word to me suggests that he was just curious, and then offered what he perhaps thought was some sound advice.
Sorry, who inquired about what? Sorry, which bit are you talking about?
This is the part we said, are you going to become a religious fanatic? He inquired.
Oh, right.
And the way I said it was more scornful, but actually this is merely just a question. No? Just, are you?
But it's a loaded question.
Yeah, it feels like a facetious one.
Is it?
Feels
Who
like,
knows? We weren't there.
It's true. It's true. It's true.
Yeah,
kind of like
I feel like
tongue-in-cheek and just kind of question in my reading of it.
Yeah, but perhaps the person that's recounting it would have used this word as to how he felt by the question, so perhaps it felt more to him like an inquiry than it did a bashment of his desires. But who knows? We weren't there.
I think you may be right. You may be right, because actually there's a question mark there, and he says he inquired, whereas he might have put exclamation and put he retorted, or something like that, and that would have been a facetious, sarcastic, all that kind of stuff, like a abusive response. Whereas you may well be right. Could be a
Can you tell I'm a teacher?
Genuine humble inquiry. Good spot, Lauren.
Yeah.
Good spot.
I did actually make this observation. If you look at the next paragraph, I thought maybe he later changed his mind, but I think this is quite right. I think it continues on this strain, because in the next paragraph, it talks about the two later meeting. Now, Bhagabati, it says, fell into step beside Abinash. And we'll talk about this, the previous sentence in a moment, but essentially the two of them were traveling home on a woodland path that day. And Bhagabati was taking one form of transportation, and Abinash must have been walking himself, as it says here. Now, Abinash actually, I can say now, he was using what's called a palanquin. If I'm saying that right?
Palanquin.
Palanquin, yeah. Palanquin. I had to Google that. I didn't know what it was. I don't know, Frank, you seem to know what it was.
No, I just imagined what it was actually, because I could see, as in, is it two men people carrying on with like a seated, is that what it is?
Essentially that, it's a covered litter, as it's called. It's a contraption, a vehicle, and it's carried with poles on the shoulders of multiple bearers usually. And that's formerly used in Eastern Asia. Usually I think of royalty when I think about this, and it does speak to maybe his standing in society and his place within the company, at the very least. Frank?
Interestingly, Tipu Sultan of Mysore, who was one of India's greatest emperors and resistors against the British Empire. He was the last king standing, as it were, in India. He had a palanquin that was like the size of 3 houses, and it was drawn by 12 elephants.
Wow!
And like 100 men and things like that. There's a painting of it in I think Powys Castle. Yeah.
Incredible. What the ego does with power. But poor Paramahansa Yogananda's father here only had servants, a few servants, and he dismissed these servants who were carrying the palanquin. And I just thought that's extremely privileged, isn't it? To have servants carrying you around. But obviously there were maybe no cars in that part of the world at that time. But I thought, what does that actually tell us about him? Because he left this luxury to go walk with Abinash. And this is to go back to what you said, Lauren, probably along the right lines. He was probably more gently coercing and inquiring, as you rightly highlighted. Because he could have just said, hey, remember what I said to you? By not, hanging out of his carriage, remember, and then just, sped off into the distance with the dust flying up in poor Abinash's face. But he didn't. He got out and he spoke to him one-to-one. Before I jump into it, guys, Priyank.
Yeah, consoled him. So he kind of almost feels a little bit bad for perhaps being a bit too harsh on him. But him being ill palanquin perhaps is also due to the fact that he actually had work. He was making the most of his productive time and commuting to work. You could do work, you could read reports, you could read accounts, comment on things, all that kind of stuff that we do now, and he could have done back then, but only if he was being carried, by these servants. So that's something. But it shows how humble he was, that he could, that it wasn't about his station. If it was about his station, he wouldn't have got off that palanquin. He would have stayed on, and it was beneath him to walk with a inferior, or to walk on the footpath, perhaps. And there are no footpaths, by the way, in these kind of parts of the world. It's mud track. Usually.
Nice use of the pun with the station there, Priyank, as well. Mike.
Unintentional.
Somehow the palanquin taints a bit the picture of the aesthetic Bhagabati for me a little bit. Like, I remember in the last episode we talked about how he was too humble to buy like a motorcycle or a car, but then it's because he didn't need one. He was being carried around in a palanquin. Maybe that was the reason. No, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but it's but it's interesting. It was probably something that was very common back in the day.
Yeah, exactly. If there's no cars and transport as we enjoy today, this was the higher society would have been able to indulge in such things. And as Priyank said, I'm sure this great man would have used the time wisely. He wasn't just sitting there, on a Game Boy or anything.
eating grapes, grapes and mangoes imported from. Yeah.
He was probably using his time very wisely, as a wise man he was. And there's just a great continuation here where
I think he's paused.
While he was saying the word continuation.
Yeah, pretty cool. The continuation is that as Bhagabati was, consoling him and making Abinash like doubt himself. Abinash is responding by like his heart repeating Lahiri Mahasaya, I cannot live without seeing you. So you got your manager talking to you about the world, how to get ahead in your company, get you more material success, and in your heart, this Abinash is just inwardly praying Lahiri Mahasaya, Lahiri Mahasaya, and he does this a bit later as well, when after Lahiri Mahasaya appears. And I just wanted to comment on this actually whilst Chris is away. Mike, do you want to come back before I do?
No, you can go.
Yeah.
Go
So there's a form of worship called japa yoga. Japa yoga is where you recite God's name again and again. So here Abinash is like saying Lahiri Mahasaya, I can't live without seeing you, and later on he says Lahiri Mahasaya, Lahiri Mahasaya. So in Japa yoga you just repeat the same name of God again and again, and that is your spiritual practice, that is your sadhana. And there's a whole spiritual path where that is all you do, and if you can do that 100% of your time, and the name on your lips as you depart from this world is that word, then it is, you'll be liberated from that point. But I was just wondering how the blessings that derive from that, because one of our listeners, Brent, was telling me to watch a film called Jason and the Argonauts, which is a 1960s film about like the Greek gods, and there's a goddess Hera, and there's this lady who's praying to Hera, and she's like repeating Hera's name, and she repeats it 5 times, and then the gods like have this consultation. Zeus and Hera have this consultation of how much blessing she should receive, and then Zeus asks her, how did he pray to you? And she said yes, and Zeus said, how many times did he specifically did she call your did this devotee call your name? And he said 5 times. And then he said, you can grant her 5 things through the course of her life. So I was wondering how relevant that is for us, like, how much blessings would we get if we made Lahiri Mahasaya, as we're walking, we're chanting Lahiri Mahasaya. If someone's questioning us, about our beliefs, etc., we're chanting, or if you've got a doubt, perhaps you're chanting Lahiri Mahasaya. Perhaps and in the later on in the autobiography, like about Babaji, he says the name, even reciting the name Babaji, attracts an instant spiritual blessing. So this Abinash is certainly making the most of his blessings, because what's about to come is pretty mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah, and seen or unforeseen blessings as well, Priyank, no? I mean, how many blessings do we receive that are obvious to us and others not so much? Sorry, I jumped in, Mike.
And the whole situation is super interesting, right? Because imagine you are Lahiri Mahasaya. So you have your student that lives pretty far away, and then you have a potential student that you're very interested in because his son will become a prophet, right? So the question is, how do you get this all? How do you get the what? How do you this one student? Apparently, you want to test his beliefs, so you want to put him in a situation where he needs to affirm, like fight to actually come and see me. And the other student, you want him to fight to come here as well. So how do I arrange a situation for both to happen at the same time? That's kind of what's happening here.
Nice, very nice reading.
Yeah, I think, Brink, what you just mentioned about the type of yoga that it is quite
Japa
beautiful
yoga.
as well. Japa yoga. So many people have asked me, like, oh, how do you meditate, or what should I do with yoga practice? How can I get into it? My response is generally follow your own path, because meditation is the peak practice of yoga, but how you actually get into the meditative state is everything. So you might find this chanting really works for you, or visuals might work better for you. This idea between audio, this sensory deprivation that we can sink ourselves into. So if this chanting really works for you, that's something your emotions can connect with, and you can really use that as a very powerful tool.
I'm sure Daya Mata used to do japa as well, often for Guruji and Babaji and other masters.
Very famous monk, professor of Brother Bhaktananda, he said he repeated Guruji's name so many times that at some point it was during Guruji's time. So there was at some point he walked past Guruji, and Guruji turned around to him and said, Bhaktananda, I love you. So he said it back to him. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I did get disconnected earlier, chaps, ladies and gents. There, sorry for that. I live in Brazil, and there's storms, thunders, and lightnings. But I shall continue on where I left off. If that's all right, Björk.
Yes.
So we were then looking at the response then, as Mike said, with Yogananda knowing that the devotee was chanting his name. Lahiri Mahasaya also knew that his devotee was chanting inwardly for his name, and he chose to bless them with an appearance to both of them, not just to the devotee. And that's something interesting, because we talk about maybe great saints and masters appearing. They tend to appear before an individual or a select few that really have been devotees for a long time, that are very, very highly evolved spiritually. But here is Lahiri Mahasaya appearing before both the person who is saying to poor Abinash, hey, no, you're not allowed to go see your guru. You have to work, you have to double down. There's no time for that. And Lahiri Mahasaya is coming before him. And what he says is super interesting. He said, Bhagabati, you're too hard on your employee. And then he vanished. And I thought to myself, oh, wow, what an experience to be blessed with in this lifetime. A great master appearing before you. And how would you have reacted, do you think? Because if you're, I wouldn't say skeptical, but he's actually, yeah, he probably is a high skeptical individual, which is quite a strong thing. But would you have reacted the way that ultimately he did, or how do you think you would have reacted in general? Because I might have just had to sit down and ponder life for a long time, but he seemed to recover quite quickly. Priyank, what do you think?
Yeah, I would have doubted myself very much in what I just saw. Like when Guruji, when he sees Sri Yukteswar, and he's recognizing this face in the alleyway, and he says, like, dreamer, walk on. You're just that's kind of image. I think that's what kind of would happen to me. Doubt would have taken over me. I remember once, similar to this, once I was meditating, I think in a room somewhere, and was having a really nice, very still meditation, and I started feeling like some warmth in the top of my head, and then I was really enjoying that sensation, and then like this became really bright up here. And I was like, wow, what is this experience? And is it finally happening? And then after a while, I opened my eyes, and like there was some improbable 6 reflections happening from the sun, and like lights reflecting. And so the sun must have come in that way, and then the light was focusing here. I was like, this, Guruji mocking me. But in reference to signs, because that obviously meant something, right? It meant something that happened, and the set of reflections, that improbable set of reflections that led to that moment, certainly wasn't a coincidence. It was, may have been Guruji making fun of how badly I want to have certain experiences, all that kind of stuff. But I think that if you read this section before they meet, Guruji poetically describes the scene. Our path took us to the edge of a tranquil field, where the rays of the late afternoon sun were crowning the tall ripple of the wild grass. And then he says, we paused in admiration. And then at that scene, that is the point where Lahiri Mahasaya appeared. And we often get experiences similar to this. And I described this one in my meditation, and that was obviously a comical one, but we get them when we're walking in nature. We would get certain things like this. Sometimes the clouds would part and there'd be a ray of sunshine just for us, or like the play of the dusk would be just absolutely phenomenal, and you're there at the most perfect time. And we may not get to the blessings of seeing Lahiri Mahasaya manifest before us, but the blessing that we are getting from being in that space and perhaps thinking of God are no less important, probably, in the grander scheme of things than having a physical darshan. And interestingly, this very scene that Guruji has described in these 2 lines was described in Mejda, in the book by Sananda Lal Ghosh, a little bit differently, a little bit more detail. And he reads this: the roadway was lined with large shady trees. Their leafy branches were intertwined overhead to form a natural caravanserai. In this peaceful setting, it is not difficult to feel the presence of the divine architect. Passing beyond the line of stately trees, they came upon a large field. Waves of rippling grass turned auburn in the flaming rays of the setting sun. Such a supernal scene they had never witnessed before. A thrill of joy filled their hearts, and both felt an overpowering desire to become one with that beauty. Father was silent, motionless, absorbed in this grand display of nature. Then, just a few yards ahead, a person of tranquil visage suddenly appeared. Abinash exclaimed, he is Lahiri Mahasaya, my guru. So Sananda Lal Ghosh, who was Guruji's brother, heard the same story from Abinash. And obviously his memory is probably, or his version of the story that he got was potentially a different one to what Guruji was. So this is why it's really nice to read different, because this is from Mejda. It's published by Self-Realization Fellowship, so it's quite nice to read the same story, but told by another devotee.
I think the way it was described, I suppose, is reminiscent for me of how Babaji appeared and then quite quickly disappeared whenever there was too much excitement, let's say, around it. Well, we'll not go into that story too much, but certainly Abinash here was on his knees chanting Lahiri Mahasaya, Lahiri Mahasaya. And meanwhile, for Bhagabati, it's his turn to be stupefied. He was sitting there, sort of not knowing what to do. But quite to his credit, clearly he could see truth when it did manifest to him, and he, as Abinash described, simply said that not only do I give you leave, but I give myself leave as well. And what I thought was interesting in the passages here was that he brought his wife along as well. So it wasn't that he was just going to go himself to see this great master. He brought his wife as well. I thought that was a lovely observation. Mike?
I found it very interesting as well, and I didn't really know what it meant. I assume that this is part of Indian culture, that like as a family you would try to not follow two different gurus, or that you would try to kind of have a common family's master or spiritual belief.
Yeah, possibly. Lauren, what's your take?
Yeah, well, I suppose also if they had that love and friendship that his mother explained to the daughter that they had, then you would, out of love, wouldn't you want to take your loved one with you on a spiritual adventure? You know, wouldn't you want to include them in that experience? Like,
and also, sorry, Mike. She had the divine experience of his birth. His birth was a divine experience. So
yes,
so she was
exactly.
no doubt, probably in some ways, intuitionally, she knew that this was a path. This was where the direction that she was meant to walk, because she's, and then and then the amulet story is coming later, but so she's had a remarkable life in many ways, and she would have been intuitionally very in tune, perhaps, with events.
It wouldn't have been anything to do with the husband suddenly saying that he was off for a week, and the wife said, "Hey, I'm going with you." You're not going anywhere.
Mike, what were you going to say?
Like he said he's gonna come even before he asked his wife, right? He kind of made the decision on the spot there, but that's probably just a sign of what kind of time we're in at this point, right? It's still 1800 something.
Yeah, I mean, to give credit where credit's due, for somebody who was expressing, let's say, skepticism, he quite quickly saw the truth with his own eyes and said, "Okay, I'm going to put aside my skepticism or my cynicism, even, and I'm going to follow this path." But what an amazing experience just to be, just to have. So we then see that the three of them set out for about 100 miles south to Gorakhpur. They traveled by horse and drawn cart. And I thought to myself, why no trains? There were no trains on that direction. 100 miles. Is it not a commonly trod path? Maybe not, but they traveled as far as they could on horse and cart, and then they I think they walked the rest of it a little bit, and they made their way to Lahiri Mahasaya. So it was a pretty quick turnaround of events from the initial disappointment that our dear friend Abinash had to being en route with Boss and Boss's wife. What a great turnaround for him. And his heart was filled with joy as he describes it. And he said, the miraculous answer to my prayer. Now, a little bit of a segue, but I thought a good one was the prayer, power of prayer, if I can say that with my Northern Irish accent. Now, the power of prayer is something that Guruji talks about quite a bit, actually. And maybe not many people know about this, but if you go on the yogananda.org website and look up prayer, there's some great material there. And I'll just read a little bit out here. It's on the website. The first rule in prayer is to approach God with legitimate desires. The second is to pray for their fulfillment, not as a beggar, but as a son or daughter, but as a son. I am thy child, thou art my father, thou and I art one. When you pray deeply and continuously, you will feel a great joy welling up in your heart. Don't be satisfied until that joy manifests. or when you feel that all-satisfying joy in your heart, you will know that God has tuned in with your prayer broadcast. Then pray to your Father, Lord, this is my need. I am willing to work for it. Please guide me and help me to have the right thoughts and to do the right things to bring about success. I will use my reason and work with determination, but guide thou my reason, will, and activity to the right thing that I should do. And if you scroll down on this page, you'll see, and we'll include a link to this because I think it is really significant and something that we can use more in our daily lives. There's further links, and there's books linked. And I think one I know somebody here is a big fan of is Sri Dayamata's book, Only Love, A Time for Surrender, A Time for Prayer. I think, Mike, you've maybe mentioned that book in the past, if I'm recalling correctly. But there's Man's Eternal Quest, and Answers to Your Prayers. He's got the book there, yes.
Signed copy.
Signed copy. And A Guide to Effective Prayer. These are books, how you can talk to God, and they're all available online to buy. And then another thing that I wanted to just mention here, before we move on, is that there is a prayer council. If you go to the centers, you'll know that there's prayers, sending out prayers to the world, to those that you love, those in need around the world. And monks and nuns of Self-Realization Fellowship they have this prayer council. They pray daily for all of those prayers that they gain through the requests that you can submit on the website. So if anybody doesn't know about that, maybe the listeners already do, but it is there if you don't know about it. Just saying, if you're ever in need, it can be a nice little boost for any physical, mental, spiritual healing, and for world peace as well. So that's a fantastic tool at our disposal. And it's, if you put a request on for prayers for yourself or others, it's there for a period of 3 months, and it's confidential. So I wanted to mention that. Mike, jump in.
I wanted to promote another booklet that is full of little inspirational quotes and prayers, called Enter the Quiet Heart, and also by Dayamata. It's amazing because I have this habit where sometimes I just grab one of Guruji's books, open it, read a sentence, put it back. And this book is really perfect for that.
Yeah, I think a lot of his words are, as we said, they age so well that they could be applied to anybody in any age since he said them. Okay, so we can look to the next and somewhat the final part of this story, which Abinash is giving to Guruji, that the next evening. But before I do, sorry, Priyank, do you want to jump in? Do you have something?
Yeah, just quickly. Did we commented that how they got their horse and cart? So I think they took the train to Benares. They entrained to Benares, Varanasi now it's called, and then they took the horse cart the rest of the distance. So from the station to their house. I don't know which bit you were going to cover now. Is that the bit you were going to cover now?
That was the bit, yeah.
Okay,
but
fine.
You're quite right, because earlier on I think I said just the horse and cart bit.
Yeah.
I didn't mention the train.
Yeah, because it would have been quite a way to go by horse cart 100 miles.
Yeah. Especially on bad roads as well.
I looked up Varanasi railway station, and it was only built in 1972, so it would have been, this brand spanking new, 1872, and it would have been this brand spanking new railway, because this would have been like in the late, what would you say, 1990, it would have been after just before Guruji's birth, so this would have been like 1982 or something, I imagine, because we know that there's going to be a prediction about Guruji that Lahiri Mahasaya is going to give.
1892, yeah. If only it was 1982.
Yeah.
If only.
But the other thing I wanted to say is Lahiri Mahasaya, he interceded here. So Yogananda describes this as an intercession into Bhagabati's life. So he was playing Zeus, as it was, in this little Leela, because he performed a miracle. So perhaps Bhagabati was taking longer than he needed to, and hence the intercession was required to come to him.
It is an interesting point, because I think by this time he may have been 40 years old, if I'm not mistaken, around then. I'd need to fact check myself before I talk, but in general, I think was he born in 1853, father? But anyway, I think he was certainly late 30s, maybe about time that he was coming down the path. But certainly, I think it was good timing, because wasn't Yogananda's mother pregnant with young Yogananda, young Mejda, in the womb, I believe, at this time. So timely instances. So they traveled, the three of them, by train, by cart. Then they had to walk through narrow lanes to get to the Guru Lahiri Mahasaya's home. And it's secluded, as it's mentioned there. So it's often spoken about Lahiri Mahasaya that he maybe had quite a secretive type of life, and maybe away from public gaze, let's say. So that's quite a beautiful thing as well. And as they went into the home, the parlor, as they describe it, they bowed before Lahiri Mahasaya, and he was sitting in his lotus posture. And that's just when I think of Lahiri Mahasaya, that's just how I see him, just in that eternal lotus posture. Greg.
Yeah, that's the really cool picture of him we have, isn't it? Him sitting in that lotus posture. This scene, as it's described here, is portrayed exceptionally well in the Awake, the Life of Yogananda film, because they kind of reenact this scene, and we talk a lot about how beautiful they did reenact this scene. It's like as if you're there. That's how beautiful they did it.
Yeah, we talked about that in the previous season of Yogananda podcast. So please do check that episode out if you want to go into more detail on that. But really, we have this scene unfolding, and it is the last, say, paragraph and a half of our story here today. And it's leveled quite flatly at Bhagabati, at Yogananda's dad, that, hey, you're being too hard on your employee, Abinash, who's probably standing right next to them. And the words were the exact same as they were a couple of days before. But if there was any doubt at all at this stage in Bhagabati's mind, it was surely erased at this point. Because it would have rung true in his ears then. That yes, this is a divine master who's called upon me in some way. Greg.
Yeah, he found, so like the couple, mother and father, came in and saw him meditating, and then he would have had his eyes closed for that, no doubt. And then Guruji says he blinked his piercing eyes and leveled them straight at your father. So you can imagine how mystical that would have been, because he's in a deep reverent meditation in the lotus posture. And in the Awake film, that it's like people are, there's lots of people around, so like it's like quite a theatrical kind of setting. And then he looks straight at him and then says this, like, because if he's in this posture, then he probably doesn't even speak much. People just come to take his darshan. Darshan means to take in and imbibe the presence of a divine form. That's what darshan means. So it would have been a silent room, and then he just blinked his eyes, stared piercingly at him, and said those quite harsh words, because everyone in the room would have been like, wow, what's this poor guy done to deserve this rebuke?
And they would have just traveled quite a long way, by horse and cart, by walking, by train, probably quite tired, scruffy. maybe.
No,
I think I enjoy-
no Indian hospitality of welcome. My wife will make you a cup of tea.
Just fine.
You're too hard.
Straight at him. And humbling, no doubt, humbling, because he was somebody in high society in many ways.
True, yeah.
And just leveled it at him, no messing around. And the way I saw it in my mind was the picture that we have of Lahiri Mahasaya with the eyes partly closed, kind of just looking at him. Hey, just pointing him out amongst the crowd. What an awesome scene! Like,
but it was also confirmation that when he saw him earlier, it wasn't a dream or anything like that. It was for real. So that way he didn't have to say, "Oh, I appeared to you" or something like that. He just knew, right?
Yeah. And really, the follow-up to it was quite nice, wasn't it? Because he actually speaks more, and he says that he was quite glad that he did listen to him, essentially, that Abinash and himself was allowed to be there, and he commented, and that you brought your wife as well, that your wife is accompanying you. And little did they know what was just about to unfold, that they were initiated then into the practice of Kriya Yoga. Now we know there's a bigger kind of story here, and it doesn't go into Abinash now, maybe for reasons, because I'm not too sure how old Yogananda would have been at this juncture when Abinash was talking to.
Difficult to say.
Because we know, a spoiler alert, that there was information given from Lahiri Mahasaya to Yogananda's mother in particular, but to the parents of the child that she was bearing. And Abinash sort of nods to that, because he said he knows that Lahiri Mahasaya said that he had a divine interest in your own birth, talking to Yogananda, and that Yogananda would be linked to Lahiri Mahasaya. So he's withholding information, potentially. If he knows that much, he probably knows a little bit more, which was that. Again, we'll not spoil it, so we'll not go into it. There's so many great stories here that we'll take it bit by bit. But the initiation, I did want to talk about this. When I read this again, I thought, okay, well, here's Yogananda saying that Abinash was relaying the story that he was initiated, his parents were initiated into the practice of Kriya Yoga. To many people, what is yoga? Yoga is going down to your local yoga center or practicing some asana yoga, but that's what people know as yoga. So the form of which you're moving your body, you're holding in postures, you're breathing, you're doing that kind of work. But here is Kriya Yoga, which would have been a question. It's the first time it's mentioned in the book, I believe. And it is mentioned many times in the book. And it's another magical way that Yogananda simply mentions it and moves on. So he doesn't go into detail. It doesn't go into major definitions at this point. Not really until page 115 do we see more descriptions of the power of Kriya Yoga and what it can do. And then ultimately chapter 26 with the science of Kriya Yoga, favorite chapter. But there is a little definition on what Kriya Yoga is in particular. Priyank, you have it actually in the book. Do you have it handy? Would you be able to read out to us now?
Yes. So Kriya is a technique taught by Lahiri Mahasaya, whereby the sensory tumult is stilled, permitting man to achieve an ever-increasing identity with cosmic consciousness. And in chapter 26, he describes the literal Sanskrit root of Kriya is Kri, which is to do, to act, and to react, which is the same root as the word found in karma, the natural principle of cause and effect. Kriya Yoga is thus union yoga with the infinite through a certain action of right, Kriya. Which is interesting that we still use this word. That word is still is a root word for many words that are still used. Like, for example, if you're going to do something, kar is the word to do, which is the same as the root word kri. So still prevalent in almost all North Indian languages.
So Yogananda doesn't go into great detail here, and it's by design, I'm sure, because he clearly could do. But there is a footnote after Kriya Yoga in the book, and it says a yogic technique taught by Lahiri Mahasaya.
That's the one I read out, Chris.
Oh, sorry, forgive me.
Yeah.
I was reading whilst you were talking.
Okay.
Thought you were reading the chapter 26 definition.
Did both beat you to it?
Which, thank you very much for beating me to it in the background. I was reading frantically to try to find it. Which is awesome, isn't it? And I think there's so much that Yogananda kind of plants the seed again and leaves it there so that we can maybe ponder subconsciously, oh, Kriya Yoga, what is this? You know, you want to know more. And then he reveals it slowly throughout the book. Lauren?
Yeah, I think it really piques the curiosity of the ever-seeking seeker within some people. I know for me, when I read it, I was like, oh, what's this Kriya Yoga? And then when I read the little footnote and I saw it was in chapter 26, I couldn't wait to get there and find out what it was. And again, I think, like you say, Chris, it's purposeful, isn't it? It's like, okay, well, I'm going to give you a nudge and I'm going to see how interested you really are, which is great.
Yeah. But he talks about initiation there as well. And that's a whole other subject that we'll not go into detail now, but it does make me question that there's many people maybe reading this for the first time thinking, oh, do you have to be initiated into yoga to do it? And certainly, I think the answer is it depends. It depends exactly on what you're talking about, what practice you're talking about, and what you're actually ultimately looking to do and achieve. With Kriya Yoga, as we know, that there's lessons to do that you would need to sign up to. To do that, you would need to be initiated. Be initiated, you would essentially sign a pledge. And when you're signing a pledge, you're devoting yourself to the Guru, not just in this lifetime to follow the teachings and the practices, but across many lifetimes, across incarnations, and it's an eternal pledge. So it is quite a significant pledge that they're making, which makes this all the more significant, does it not? That here's two individuals who are coming to see a realized master, that they're simply bowing before this master, knowing in true wisdom that here is somebody who is worthy of pledging your love and devotion to. And I just thought that was a real significant moment, that there was an instant love and instant connection that would have been maybe due to past incarnations, that the connections were there. So beautiful moment. And really, this looks to wrap up the end of our paragraph in wonderful fashion. Priyank, do you have a comment to make?
Yeah, I know you touched on the fact that the comment that Lahiri Mahasaya took a definite interest in Paramahansa Yogananda's birth. So I just thought I'd further emphasize that point. So we're going to talk about this is covered in a lot more detail later on, and it's also covered in Mejda as well in more details than here. So we'll cover that, but it's obviously a very monumental moment for Gyan Prabhakosh, or the mother, potentially more so than even Bhagabati, because of her previous visions and signs and the birth of Yogananda, which is to come. So yeah, just thought and I really like the bit where it says your life shall surely be linked with his own, i.e. Paramahansa Yogananda and Lahiri Mahasaya's, and then it says the master's blessing never fails. It's a really heartwarming sentence, that last sentence.
Yeah. Which is a really good spot, Priyank. Thanks for coming back to that. You've got Abinash who was through love and devotion being able to conjure the attention of his master, who ultimately played this great part in this story, and he's relaying this to Yogananda. And that's, as we mentioned about role models, about having saintly people in your life, a real blessing. And Yogananda would have been learning, in real time, maybe as a young man or a young boy, depending on when this story was told, about the power of this that would prove to be very useful in his own life, with the experience he has with Lahiri Mahasaya coming to his aid, not once, but more times that we'll talk about in future episodes. But Mike, want to jump in?
Yeah, and the way that Guruji is being told about the prophecy with the amulet later on is fascinating, where his mother doesn't want to, she probably wants him to have a normal childhood, right, before she bestows on him the visions that, and then she passes away early. But we'll see all that in the future episodes.
Spoiler alert. Lauren, what's coming up in the next episode?
Oh, yes, we've got a lovely next few paragraphs in our chapter. So it then leads on to explain and really give us an insight to the family's relationship to Lahiri Mahasaya after Yogananda's birth, and consequently Yogananda's relationship to Lahiri Mahasaya throughout his childhood. So I think that's going to be a really lovely episode for us to delve into next time. And I hope our lovely listeners and watchers will join us. On that note, I would just like to say that we have been loving reading your comments on the videos, and it's been really touching and heartwarming. So as your homework, I would just say keep that up and read or listen to the chapter if you can, that next little section. Yeah, Priyank.
And as a little teaser, did you know, or do you think that Lahiri Mahasaya ever met Mukunda? Do you think? What do you think, Chris?
You physically met him?
Yes, physically met him.
He passed before Mukunda was born? Is that right?
Nope, he did not.
Is that all right?
No, he did not. But it was very close. And he did actually meet him. It's actually, the meeting is described in Mejda. And we will, but it's not in the Autobiography of a Yogi. So we will talk about that, Lauren, in your episode. That beautiful meeting.
Yes. So yeah, Lahiri Mahasaya was born 30th of September 1828, passed Masmari 26th of September 1895.
My birthday.
Yeah. Is it?
Not the year, just the month and the day.
Oh.
The month and day.
You look good, Priyanka.
I knew there was something different about you.
Definitely not a young adult me, Mike.
Young adult at heart.
So yeah, that's lovely. Then, if you want to do the homework, read up to "O Omnipresent Master." I thank that thy light hath healed my son. Read up to that paragraph, and you shall be with us and can join in on the next episode. But until then, thank you all for listening. Thanks for joining. Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.
God bless.
Jai Guru.